Welcome once again to Esoteric Guardian. Today, we're diving into one of the most unsettling questions in both literature and occult philosophy. What if the gods of H.P. Lovecraft weren't just fictional inventions, but echoes of something far older, something real, and buried just beneath the surface of our collective memory? Lovecraft was a self-proclaimed atheist, a strict materialist. He never believed in gods, spirits, or the supernatural, at least not openly. And yet, the beings he wrote about, ancient, formless, beyond time, bear striking similarities to entities whispered about in esoteric traditions around the world, not just in how they look, but in what they represent: chaos, dissolution, forbidden knowledge, and the thin veil between madness and truth. Some researchers have suggested that Lovecraft may have accessed something he didn't fully understand, that through his dreams, his isolation, and his obsessive exploration of the unknown, he became a vessel, not for imagination, but for transmission. In this video, we're going to explore those theories. We'll compare Lovecraft's cosmic horrors to ancient occult archetypes. We'll look at how names like Nyarlathotep, Yog-Sothoth, and Azathoth may align with real esoteric forces. And we'll ask the question that lies at the heart of this journey. What if these gods don't need to exist in flesh to be real? What if remembering them is enough? One of the clearest signs that Lovecraft may have been tapping into something deeper than just fiction is the way many of his creations resemble ancient figures from spiritual and mythological traditions around the world, not in name or shape, but in structure, in behavior, and in what they represent. This isn't about copying specific deities or retelling old stories. It's about echoing certain patterns, the kind that appear again and again throughout history in different cultures. Entities that shift forms, that blur the line between good and evil, that serve as messengers, tricksters, or gatekeepers to something greater. Nyarlathotep is a perfect example. He changes shape constantly. He interacts with humanity directly, unlike most of Lovecraft's distant cosmic gods. And his presence is never just physical. It distorts perception, thought, and even time. In that sense, he resembles figures like Elegua, the Orisha from West African religions who governs the crossroads. Elegua wears many faces, moves between worlds, and controls access to spiritual paths. Without his permission, nothing begins and nothing ends. You see similar themes in Shiva, the Hindu god who represents both destruction and creation. He can bring chaos, but also transformation. His presence marks the collapse of old structures, but also the beginning of new cycles. Like Nyarlathotep, Shiva isn't simply one thing. He exists in contradiction, not as a mistake, but as a fundamental principle. Even in Norse mythology, we find Loki, the trickster. Unreliable, unpredictable, but also necessary. He causes disorder, but often for a purpose that isn't clear until much later. These figures aren't evil in a conventional sense. They're not final bosses. They're not there to be defeated. They represent thresholds, points of transition. They test those who seek power, knowledge, or change. And what they offer usually comes with a cost. Nyarlathotep follows this same logic. He doesn't attack people. He leads them towards something they think they want: a vision, a revelation, a truth. But once they get there, they're no longer who they were. These kinds of beings don't just guard secrets, they are the test. In every culture, there are stories of entities like this. Not divine rulers, not pure destroyers, but something in between. Something more dangerous because it's harder to recognize. They aren't just symbols of fear, they're mirrors, and those who face them rarely come back unchanged. The idea that Lovecraft may have unconsciously tapped into something older than fiction becomes even more compelling when viewed through the lens of certain occult thinkers, chief among them the controversial Kenneth Grant. Grant wasn't just a reader, he was Aleister Crowley's personal secretary and later the architect of his own esoteric system, the Typhonian tradition. Within that framework, Grant made a startling claim that Lovecraft's so-called fiction wasn't fiction at all, but a symbolic transmission of ancient, non-human forces. He believed Lovecraft, through his dreams, psychological isolation, and compulsive creativity, became a kind of unconscious medium, a vessel not for fantasy, but for archetypal energies that exist beyond human understanding. Grant pointed to the mythos's internal structure, the way entities relate, how they influence minds, how they lie dormant until called, and noted its eerie similarity to the cosmology of the Typhonian current, which centers chaos not as disorder, but as a primordial creative force. In this system, Cthulhu, Yog-Sothoth, and Azathoth aren't evil. They're vast intelligences that existed before humanity, alien not because they're hostile, but because they operate on planes we can't comprehend. Not gods in a theological sense, but principles, catalytic presences that can leak into our world through dreams, symbols, or altered states. Here is where chaos magic enters. Grant's interpretation anticipated what chaos magicians later embraced, that belief, symbol, and imagination are not just inner states, they're tools. If a mythology resonates deeply enough, it doesn't matter if it's invented, it works. Grant saw the Necronomicon, Lovecraft's fictional grimoire, as a perfect example. To him, it didn't need to be real to be operative. It was an egregore, a psychic construct made powerful through attention and emotion. Its true function wasn't to summon demons, but to unlock consciousness. A magical key designed to shift perception and awaken contact with something outside ordinary awareness. In that sense, reading Lovecraft, especially with intent, became a kind of ritual. The stories weren't just fiction. They were maps, triggers, invitations. And remembering these entities, even as fantasy, was enough to draw them nearer. Among all of Lovecraft's creations, few are as unsettling or as conceptually overwhelming as Yog-Sothoth. Unlike most deities in mythology, Yog-Sothoth has no stable form, no face, no human traits to hold on to. It's not just a creature beyond time, it is time. A consciousness that sees everything at once, existing simultaneously across all points of space and history, yet remaining completely inaccessible to human understanding. To describe Yog-Sothoth as a god is misleading. In modern occult terms, it's closer to a principle, a breaking point in the fabric of space-time, a rupture in how reality holds itself together. Some occultists have compared it to Da'ath, the invisible, often forbidden sphere in the Kabbalistic tree of life. Da'ath represents hidden knowledge, the link between the upper and lower worlds. But it's also a trap. Crossing it unprepared can lead to total collapse of the self. Yog-Sothoth mirrors that same paradox. It is knowledge without filters, truth without symbols, pure perception stripped of context. And the human mind, which depends on structure and contrast to understand anything at all, simply isn't built to survive that kind of exposure. This is where non-Euclidean geometry, a recurring theme in Lovecraft's writing, becomes more than just a literary device. It symbolizes the breakdown of everyday perception. In Euclidean space, we assume things like parallel lines, 90-degree angles, and solid dimensions. But Lovecraft's worlds twist those assumptions. Angles behave wrong. Shapes defy logic. Buildings seem to expand or collapse depending on how you look at them. In the presence of Yog-Sothoth, reality loses its consistency, and that's the point. Yog-Sothoth doesn't judge, it doesn't punish, it simply is. But the act of perceiving it, even briefly, is often enough to dissolve the human psyche, not through violence, but through exposure to something that cannot be made sense of. In esoteric thought, this is the essence of contact with the absolute. Mystical systems throughout history have described the moment when the ego dissolves, when the self disappears, and something larger floods in. Depending on the tradition, this is either spiritual enlightenment or madness. And that's what Yog-Sothoth represents. Not evil, not chaos, but pure contact, with a consciousness so vast, so total, that the individual mind collapses in its presence. To mystics, this is both a warning and a goal, because beyond that collapse lies transformation, or complete erasure. In many spiritual traditions, especially within Kabbalah, the journey toward enlightenment is symbolized by the Tree of Life, a vertical path of ascension through 10 divine spheres, each one representing a stage of consciousness, virtue, or spiritual realization. But alongside this sacred structure, there exists a lesser-known mirror, a shadow tree, one that descends rather than ascends, a system that doesn't lead to divinity, but into the depths of the psyche, into chaos, fragmentation, and ultimately transformation. This is the Qliphoth, also known as the Tree of Death. Each sphere on the Qliphoth is a distorted reflection of the ones found on the Tree of Life. Where one offers order, the other offers dissolution. Where one guides the soul upward, the other pulls it inward or downward into confrontation with its own hidden forces. These spheres aren't ruled by angels or archangels, but by entities often described as demonic, though more accurately, they're raw, untamed principles of breakdown, inversion, and shadow integration. It's within this framework that a number of occult scholars have begun to read Lovecraft's mythology, not as random fiction, but as a kind of modern esoteric code. In this view, the Cthulhu mythos is not an invented cosmology, but a symbolic reconstruction of the Qliphoth itself. His entities, far from being arbitrary monsters, would instead function as personifications of these chaotic spheres, gateways to specific layers of unconscious descent. This interpretation radically shifts how we understand Lovecraft's work. The beings he describes, ancient, incomprehensible, indifferent to human life, begin to resemble not external invaders, but internal forces, each one reflecting a deeper layer of the psyche, an aspect of consciousness that modern language struggles to express. What appears to be cosmic horror in this context becomes psychological and spiritual confrontation. The terror isn't just in what these beings are, but in what they reveal about the nature of reality and the self. It's a descent, not a damnation. In the same way, the Qliphoth is not simply a system of evil, but a symbolic journey through dissolution, the stripping away of illusions, identities, and attachments. A process that destroys what is false in order to reveal what might be real, though incomprehensible. In this model, Lovecraft's gods do not exist in a far-off galaxy. They live at the edges of perception, buried deep within the unconscious. His stories, then, are not just tales of ancient beings returning from the void, but allegories of spiritual collapse and the possibility of rebirth on the other side. Because in many occult paths, before illumination comes descent. Before unity, there is fragmentation. And before awakening, there is madness. Lovecraft may not have believed in the supernatural, but whether he intended it or not, His mythos mirrors one of the oldest spiritual structures humanity has ever conceived. Not one of light and harmony, but one that forces us to pass through our shadows, our illusions, and our deepest fears. His stories might be fiction, but their structure is ritual. If Lovecraft rejected all forms of mysticism, if he explicitly described himself as a materialist and skeptic, then how do we explain the fact that so many of the entities and structures he created seem to align with long-standing esoteric archetypes and occult systems, not just vaguely, but with a level of symbolic coherence that even trained initiates spend decades trying to piece together? This is where a more uncomfortable idea begins to emerge, one that has been proposed by various scholars of the occult and depth psychology alike. The possibility that Lovecraft acted as a kind of unconscious medium, someone who, without subscribing to any spiritual worldview, was nevertheless exceptionally sensitive to symbolic currents operating below the surface of individual awareness, what Carl Jung would call the collective unconscious, and what many occult traditions would simply refer to as the astral or archetypal plane. In this sense, Lovecraft didn't need to believe in what he was writing, because the power of what he tapped into wasn't dependent on conscious intent. His isolation, his intense dream life, his obsessive immersion in themes of otherness, and his detachment from conventional human concerns made him, perhaps unwillingly, an ideal conduit for symbolic content that bypasses the rational mind altogether and instead expresses itself through story, imagery, and emotional resonance. He may have thought he was inventing monsters, building fictions, exploring metaphors for fear and cosmic indifference. But the structures he produced, the hierarchies, the languages, the gateways, the functions of the entities themselves, mirror so closely the logic found in mystical and magical systems that it's hard to attribute it all to coincidence or literary instinct. And this is where the deeper implication lies, that when someone works intensely with certain symbols, especially those connected to fear, transformation, chaos, and the unknown, those symbols don't just sit inert on the page. They begin to work through the writer, shaping the narrative from the inside out, and sometimes influencing readers in ways that are difficult to trace, but impossible to deny. Lovecraft, as a lifelong skeptic, would never have entertained this idea. But perhaps that's precisely why the theory is so compelling, because in his refusal to assign meaning to what he was channeling, he left the door open for the material itself to act freely, not filtered through belief, but expressed in its raw form. And maybe that's why his work has endured, not because of what he intended, but because of what he unknowingly revealed. He didn't bring the gods of the mythos into existence, but he gave them form, language, and presence in the modern world. Not in temples or rituals, but in the minds of readers, in the corners of imagination, and in the quiet suggestion that some stories aren't invented, they're remembered. Perhaps the most unsettling truth behind Lovecraft's work is not that he created monstrous deities, but that those deities seem to emerge from a deeper layer of reality, one that transcends myth, language, and even intention. Though he denied all belief in the supernatural, his visions mirror ancient structures of occult knowledge with uncanny precision. This has led many to suspect that his stories were not mere fiction, but the spontaneous expression of something older and far more complex. Forces that have always been there, echoing through dreams, symbols, and archetypes across every civilization. His gods were never meant to be worshipped, understood, or even named. They exist on the threshold, beyond reason, beyond morality, beyond form. And whether we interpret them as metaphors of the unconscious, emanations from the Qliphoth, or manifestations from other planes, their impact remains the same. They pull back the curtain of reality just enough to reveal how fragile it is. Not to terrify us with noise and violence, but with silence, scale, and indifference. That is the true essence of Lovecraft's horror. The slow, dawning awareness that what lies beyond the stars is not evil or good, but utterly alien. Not darkness, but a light so overwhelming it strips away the illusion of control, of meaning, of self. In that sense, Lovecraft may not have believed in his gods, but perhaps they believed in him. Or perhaps they simply found, in his pen, a suitable vessel. Thank you for staying until the end. If this content resonated with you, consider supporting this journey into the hidden layers of reality. Like, share, and subscribe to help us keep unveiling the veil. And above all, never stop questioning. What you call imagination might be memory. What you call fiction might be revelation.